All right, hey everybody, and welcome to our second video for our Unit 3 discussion about the skeletal system. So in this video, hopefully it'll be a little bit shorter than the last one. I know that one got kind of long. I talk about the formation of bone tissue, so how we build bones, how we maintain, repair them, and what happens as we age. All right, so the term ossification refers to bone formation. So you might see ossification, you might see osteogenesis. They're both the same way. So genesis means formation, osteo means bone, so they both mean the same thing. So we undergo bone formation a few different times in our life, right? So we obviously have to form bone as an embryo. So as we're a growing, developing fetus in the womb, we have to build new bones from where there were no bones before. And then those bones that we build have to continue to grow bigger and bigger and bigger until we reach our full adult size. And then even as adults, we're continuously remodeling and rebuilding that bone. So it doesn't stay the same your entire life. And then if you ever break a bone, we need to repair it. So ossification we use for all of those situations. All right, so two main types of ossification that we use to form all the bones in your body. The first one is intramembranous ossification. So intra means within, membranous is a membrane. So intramembranous ossification is the building of bones within a membrane. So this is mostly how we build your spongy bone. So this is mostly for bones like your flat bones of your skull, for your ribs and your sternum are formed through intramembranous ossification. The other one, endochondral ossification, endo means within, chondral refers to cartilage. So this one is ossification or the building of bones within cartilage, where we start by basically a cartilaginous model of a bone and we slowly kind of turn that into bone from what used to be cartilage. All right, so let's look at the intramembranous ossification first. So this one, remember when we talked about the structure of your flat bones and how it's kind of like a sandwich where we've got compact bone on either side and then like the middle part of that sandwich is spongy bone. So those are the bones that are formed through intramembranous ossification. So they're kind of, we've got those two sandwiches of the compact bone and then within them is where we're forming this new bone. Right, so intramembranous ossification starts with an ossification center. So let me highlight that for you guys here. So ossification center in here where we're developing new bone. So the bone cells, the osteoblasts, are taking calcium phosphate, taking calcium out of the bloodstream and depositing that mineral in a matrix that will eventually harden and become bone. Right, so then we start to build all of these little trabeculae that are coming together, like down here in this picture, and eventually we have this bony tissue complete. Right, so that's how we form our like skull bones, ribs. Most of the long bones in your body are formed by endochondral ossification. So again, within the cartilage. So this basically means that your body, as you're developing, like this little baby here, when you're developing, we start off by making tiny, tiny little cartilaginous models of bones. They look like they're in the shape of a bone, like this, but they're not made of bone. They're made of cartilage. And now eventually that cartilage will all come to be replaced by bony tissue. So it doesn't turn into bony tissue. We actually kind of destroy the cartilage, and as we're destroying that, we're replacing it with new bone. Right, so in endochondral ossification for long bones like this, we usually have a few different ossification centers. So we'll have an ossification center here in the middle of the diaphysis, and then we usually kind of build some at the epiphyses as well. And then eventually those two regions will grow together, right? So in here we can see, let me highlight the epiphyseal growth plate, right? And so remember that epiphyseal growth plate is the plate where we have continuous bone building. And so that's how our long bones get longer, right? So the diaphysis will continue to grow longer into those epiphyses. And eventually, when this baby is, roughly 20 years old, those epiphyseal growth plates will seal and then become just epiphyseal lines. All right, so here again we can see those epiphyseal plates. growing as a child becomes bigger. So epiphyseal plate between the diaphysis of this bone and the epiphysis of the bone. And then again, we have another one down here. So you're looking at a knee joint here. So femur, the bone of the thigh, has its own epiphyseal plate between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. And then down here, the tibia, which is the bone of the leg, has its own epiphyseal plate between the diaphysis of that bone and the epiphysis of that bone. So each one of these bones that's growing is going to have its own epiphyseal plate, and that's the center of growth. So that's how the bones get longer and longer and longer until you finished growing, you know, around about 20 years old. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what encourages bones to grow. So the obvious hormone that encourages bone growth is growth hormone, right? So human growth hormone is your main anabolic hormone. We talked about the word anabolism a couple weeks ago and how that means building or growth, making larger molecules out of smaller ones. So growth hormone is the one that's triggering this anabolic growth, that's telling your bones to continue growing. So telling your osteoblasts continue to lay down more bony tissue so that we can keep getting bigger. But even as you stop getting bigger, so once those epiphyseal growth plates have sealed, you'll still be remodeling bone throughout your entire life. So we'll still be remodeling, which means we're sucking bone away and depositing new bone in different places so that we can build bones in the strongest, most efficient way possible. Once we're done getting bigger, we can still grow our bones thicker, so bones can become more robust, become stronger through what's known as appositional growth. So appositional growth means that we're building thicker, more strong, robust bones. All right. There are some things that can go wrong here. So a couple note on a few different disorders, things that can happen, especially when we've got hormone action not working as it should. So the first one I'll talk about is acromegaly. So acromegaly is a condition where you continue to produce too much growth hormone into adulthood. Right, so if for example, after your epiphyseal growth plates close, so you're a full adult, your bones aren't getting any longer, you're not going to get any taller, but if you're still producing too much growth hormone, then your bones will just keep getting thicker and thicker and thicker, and that's known as acromegaly. And because it includes all of the bones in your body, including the ones of the face, it can change your appearance as you get older because your bones just become thicker and thicker with age. Now, if you have too much growth hormone before your epiphyseal growth plates have sealed, that's what results in gigantism. So, and that's where we get actual giants or people that are very, very tall, is because they're getting too much encouragement from that growth hormone and their epiphyseal plates have not sealed, so they can still get taller and taller. Another thing we should mention here is the loss of calcium that a lot of times comes with age, is known as osteoporosis. And it basically just means your bones are becoming more porous because they're losing some of that calcium content, some of that mineral content that keeps them strong. We also sometimes see bones that are a little bit soft. Soft bones usually can happen in a couple different ways. So rickets is when this happens in children. So it usually happens when children aren't exposed to enough sunlight. And they have a vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D is going to be really important for the absorption of calcium from the food that you eat, right? So you can't absorb enough calcium if you don't eat enough vitamin D or create enough vitamin D in your skin, and that can lead to rickets, which is soft bones in children that causes them to kind of bend. Osteomalacia would be if you have soft bones in adulthood. All right, so here's some images of what this looks like. So the lady here on the left-hand side of your screen, she had acromegaly. So we can see that's the same lady in all four of those pictures, but she looks really different as she ages. And it's not just because she's getting older, it's because her bones are continuing to become more robust or thicker as she ages because of the acromegaly. And then the picture on the right there is rickets. So rickets, again, is just softening of the bones because the body is not absorbing enough calcium from the diet, usually as a result of a vitamin D deficiency. All right, let's talk a little bit about bone fractures. So probably most people have broken a bone at some point of their lives or know somebody who has, so fractures are pretty common. Um, so they happen, and even people with very healthy, strong bones, we can still have fractures. There's several different types of fractures, so we're going to go through what some of these fracture types look like so we can tell the difference between them. So these aren't in order of the pictures over here, but the first one, I'll just go down the list here. The first one, a transverse fracture, is where we've got a cut that's basically across the long axis of the bone. So this would be kind of like a transverse or a horizontal line through the bone. Right? So that's a transverse fracture. An oblique one is one that's going to be like an angle, right? So oblique means at an angle. So it's not a total perpendicular cut through the bone. It's going to be happening at an angle that's oblique. A spiral one is a fracture that kind of goes around at a circle around the long axis of a bone. Spiral fractures, these are more commonly a result of a twisting motion. So sometimes, like, you know, kids when they're playing on chairs, they kind of get their feet between the back of the chair, and if they fall off the chair at that point and there's a twisting motion of the leg, that can create a spiral fracture. Comminuted fractures are ones that have a whole bunch of different breaks in them. So we have multiple pieces of bone. Impacted is when we are basically driving two bones together. So we're driving usually the proximal end of a bone into, or I'm sorry, the distal end of the bone into the proximal end of the bone. So this can happen, that's common if you're like breaking a fall, for example. So if you fall forward and you're kind of pushing I'm trying to get myself in the camera, the distal end of the bone into the proximal end of the bone, resulting in an impacted fracture. And a green stick fracture, this one is a partial fracture, usually happening only on one side of the bone and the other side of the bone is intact. So there's a picture of it there in G, for example there. So the bone is broken on one side, but the other half of the bone is intact. Kind of like if you tried to break a stick from a tree that was still green, right? It doesn't snap apart so easily. It kind of bends a little bit, which results in breakage on one side, but not on the other. Right, and then an open or compound fracture is one that breaks the skin. So if the bone literally protrudes outside of the skin, that's an open fracture. A closed one or simple fracture is one that does not break the skin. Okay, so once we've broken the bone, then the next step is to hopefully repair it. So we've got a few different steps for fracture repair. The first step in the repair of a hematoma. So a hematoma is this large amount of surface of the skin around where the break happened. So we can see in this picture here, remember that bones are made of osteons, and in the central canal of osteons are blood vessels. So here's a blood vessel that's kind of running through an osteon here. As we break bone, we're also going to break the blood vessels that are within the bone. Right, so blood is going to start leaking out of those vessels, and that's what creates this hematoma, which is part of the healing process. So drawing more blood to the area of the fracture is going to bring more white blood cells that can start to clean up debris. It's going to cause some inflammation, which is going to help kickstart the healing process of this fracture. All right. Step number 2 is the creation of a callus. So callus, this can take a few weeks to form this callus. So we're removing all of like the debris, the little tiny shards of bone and stuff that was formed from the break. And now we're depositing some of um, the organic components of bones. We're going to add some collagen, some protein, to start to develop this kind of fibrous callus that's going to start holding the broken ends of the bone back together. Right. After we've got that fibrous kind of callus that's made out of collagen and other proteins, then we're going to start to replace that protein with actual bone, so mineralized bone. So this next step is the formation of a bony callus. So now we're building bone back into where it's been depleted. And then the last step is remodeling. So remember that bone is constantly being broken down and rebuilt, being remodeled like this. This is especially true for repair of fractures. oftentimes the remodeling of the bone isn't going to be totally perfect to how the bone was before. So even in this picture here, we can see that our, our osteon is not straight across anymore. We've got this sort of wavy line here. We can see on the outside there's still a little bump there. So that might take a while to remodel, and it might not ever be perfectly smooth again, but it's part of the process of repairing this bone. It's not always perfect. All right, so we know we need calcium to build bones because most of the mineral content of bone is calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. And we get that calcium mainly from your diet, right? So you have to eat calcium in order to have it available for the production of bone. Um, Problem with that is that you cannot absorb calcium from your intestines without vitamin D, right? So we need vitamin D in order to be able to even absorb that calcium to get it in our bloodstream in the first place. So two ways that we get vitamin D. One is we manufacture it on our own. So your epidermis can make vitamin D if you expose it to enough UV sunlight. And also you can get it from your diet. So a lot of our foods are artificially fortified with vitamin D because, there are places that don't get enough sunlight, and increased melanin production in your skin can preclude you from absorbing enough UV radiation to create that vitamin D. So we get it from our foods, and we also get it from exposure to UV light. All right, so there are two major hormones that control the amount of calcium that you have in your bloodstream at any given time. So remember, calcium is important for your bones, but it also has a lot of other jobs in your body, so we need to maintain adequate levels of it in your bloodstream. The two major hormones that are kind of in control here are parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone is made by your parathyroid glands. So the parathyroid glands sit on the posterior aspect of your thyroid. So thyroid gland sits right here in your neck. The parathyroid glands sit on the posterior of that, so on the back of it. And their main job is making parathyroid hormone. Right, so that parathyroid hormone, once it's made, will trigger osteoclasts, so the bone-eating cells, to start to dissolve bone and return that calcium to the bloodstream. Right, so that's what parathyroid hormone does. It dissolves bone and adds calcium back into the bloodstream. So when blood calcium levels are low, if they're too low, then that's going to kickstart a feedback loop. Remember we talked about feedback loops. So a negative feedback loop is going to tell the parathyroid gland to make more parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone will travel in the bloodstream until it finds osteoclasts. It'll tell those osteoclasts to resorb bone, so dissolve that bone, get the minerals back into the bloodstream until our blood calcium levels go back up to homeostasis, at which point the feedback loop shuts off and we stop making any more parathyroid hormone, right? Calcitonin has an opposite action. So calcitonin is made by your thyroid gland, not the parathyroid, but the thyroid. His job is to, if blood calcium levels are too high, so you've been eating a lot of good calcium, you got a lot of good vitamin D, your blood calcium levels are high, calcitonin will be released to tell your osteoblasts to create more bone. So osteoblasts, once they get this signal from calcitonin, will start taking calcium out of the bloodstream and putting it into bone to make your bones stronger and bigger, right? So parathyroid hormone is going to raise calcium levels in the blood. Calcitonin will lower calcium levels in the blood. So they have opposite actions. Right. So a few other hormones here that are going to impact your skeletal system. So we mentioned growth hormone early on. So growth hormone is important for overall growth of your bones. Thyroxine. So thyroxine is important for your metabolic rate. And so metabolism is closely tied to growth. So higher rate of metabolism, higher rate of growth in general, which is going to impact your bones. We talked about the calcitonin and parathyroid. Let's look at those, the one in the middle there, sex hormones. Shockingly, sex hormones do have a lot to do with your bones. So production of sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, those hormones promote strong, healthy bones. In fact, when we start aging to the point where those hormone levels begin to diminish after menopause or andropause, then our bones get a little bit weaker because those hormones aren't there encouraging deposition of new bony tissue as much as they were, say, younger at points in our life. All right, so here's that homeostasis feedback loop for calcium that I was just talking about. So remember that calcium is an important mineral that we have to have in your bloodstream, but also have to have in your bones. So your body's always trying to balance the amount necessary in the blood versus the amount that is currently stored in the bone. So if blood calcium levels are too low, parathyroid hormone will be released in order to raise blood calcium up. If blood calcium levels are too high, calcitonin will be released in order to bring those blood calcium levels back down by depositing more calcium into the bones themselves. Okay, a quick look at some results of aging in the bone. So osteoporosis is a common one. So as we age, our bones can become more brittle. And this can be for a lot of reasons, but it tends to come down to the inability to absorb as much calcium as is necessary. So we can't take in as much calcium from our food anymore as we age. And also, we're losing the effect of those sex hormones after menopause or andropause, which means that those sex hormones aren't encouraging the deposition of new bone as much. So the bone starts to look a little bit porous, so it has holes in it, so hence osteoporosis. All right, so so decrease in bone mass occurs as we age. So after we hit that kind of midlife and move into older age, then we're just going to have more of that bone loss. This tends to be, we see a little bit more bone loss in women. So osteoporosis is more common in females because female bones tend to be just a little bit more slight to begin with. So they tend to have less massive bones to begin with, so there just isn't as much to lose as far as compared to men. All right. So so the two principal effects of aging here are that we lose bone mass, so overall mass of the bone goes down, and also the bones can get a little bit more brittle. So remember we said that collagen is really important for giving bones some of their kind of tensile strength and flexibility. Because if you don't have that collagen in there, then the bones themselves become very brittle and they're more likely to shatter. So as we age, they get more brittle because we're losing some of the tensile strength that comes with the collagen proteins. All right, so made it to the end of another one here. So let's go through some of these questions and see how you do. So what vitamin is required for the absorption of calcium from your digestive system? What vitamin do we need for that? All right, I'll let you think on it. What are the two sources of this vitamin? So where do we get this vitamin from? And then the third question here is what hormone promotes the resorption of calcium from bone? All right, so remember resorption means to dissolve it out of the bone and get it back into the bloodstream. All right, so hopefully you've thought about those three questions. All right, so here's your answers. So the vitamin that's required for absorption of calcium from the digestive system is vitamin D. So we need to have adequate amounts of vitamin D in order to get that calcium in the first place. So a lot of times if you go buy a calcium supplement over the counter, it's not just calcium, it's calcium and vitamin D because you need both of them together. All right, so the two sources of this vitamin, so we can get it from our diet or supplements or sunlight, right? So your epidermis will make it if exposed to UV light. And then the hormone that promotes the resorption of calcium from your bone is parathyroid hormone, or PTH. All right, last question here to describe the following types of fractures. So compound fracture, green stick fracture, and an impacted fracture. Think about what those fracture types look like, what's happened to cause those types of fractures. I'll give you a second. Okay, so a compound fracture is one that breaks the skin. So that means that the bone has broken to the point where it's sticking out of the skin. A green stick fracture is one where you have a break on one side of the bone and you don't have a break on the other. So you've got kind of a half broken bone. It doesn't go all the way through the bone. And an impacted fracture is where the distal portion of the bone has been kind of forced into the proximal end of the bone. Usually this type of fracture results from trying to break a fall by putting your arm out in front of you. Puts a lot of pressure on the distal end of the bone into the proximal end. Okay, so I hope that was helpful as we kind of dig into the skeletal system a little bit more. Let me know if you have any questions. All right, see you guys on the next one.